Chapter 46 Coronary Circulation. About one third of all the deaths in industrialized countries of the Western world often result from coronary artery disease. However, this has become an increasing problem in developing countries as lifespans increase and lifestyle behaviors change. For this reason, understanding normal and pathological physiology of the coronary circulation is one of the most important subjects in medicine. So in this figure, you can see the heart and its coronary blood supply. So this is the right coronary artery, as you can see here. It gives a right marginal branch and mainly gives the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, in most cases, which is the right predominance. There's also left predominance in some people, whereas wherein the posterior interventricular artery is from the left coronary artery. As you can see here, this is a left coronary artery. It divides into a circumflex branch and and an anterior interventricular branch. It also gives a small left marginal branch here. Okay. You can see the conus branches which form the annulus of Wissens. That is all in anatomy. Okay. So we need to note that the main coronary arteries lie on the surface of the heart and smaller arteries then penetrate from the surface into the cardiac muscle mass. Okay, like this. It is almost entirely through these arteries that the heart receives its nutritive blood supply. Only the inner 1/10 mm of the endocardial surface can obtain significant nutrition directly from the blood inside the cardiac chambers, so this source of muscle nutrition is minuscule. The left coronary artery supplies mainly the anterior and left lateral portions of the left ventricle, whereas the right coronary artery supplies most of the right ventricle as well as the posterior part of the left ventricle in 80 to 90% of people. This is called right predominance. Most of the coronary venous blood flow from the left ventricular muscle returns to the right atrium of the heart by way of the coronary sinus, which is about 75% of the total coronary blood flow. On the other hand, most of the coronary venous blood from the right ventricular muscle returns to small anterior cardiac veins that flow directly into the right atrium, not by way of the coronary sinus. And a very small amount of coronary venous blood then flows back into the heart through very minute Thebetian veins which empty directly into all chambers of the heart. Normal coronary blood flow averages 5% of cardiac output. You can remember it like this. The heart has 4 chambers, so 4 to 5% of the cardiac output is the coronary blood flow. It averages 70 ml per 100 grams of heart weight, or about 225 ml per minute, which is, cardiac output is 5 liters per 5 liters. You can consider it like that. So 5 liters per minute, right? So 5%, 5 by 100 into 5, which is about 25 by 100 liters. Okay. And so that is about 250. So 250 ml per minute, you can consider it as 225 because it is 4 to 5. So during strenuous exercise, the heart in the young adult increases its cardiac output 4-fold to 7-fold, and it pumps this blood against a higher than normal arterial pressure. Consequently, the work output of the heart under severe conditions may increase 6-fold to 9-fold. At the same time, the coronary blood flow increases 3-fold or 4-fold to supply the extra nutrients needed by the heart. Coming to phasic changes in coronary blood flow during systole and diastole. So we need to note from this diagram that the coronary blood flow decreases during systole and increases during diastole. This is because during systole, the cardiac muscles, they contract and there is a reduction in the subendocardial coronary blood flow. During diastole, there is an increase in the subendocardial blood flow. Okay. So this is what is mentioned here. Coronary capillary blood flow in the left ventricle muscle, it falls to a low value during systole. The reason for this phenomenon is strong compression of the intramuscular blood vessels by the left ventricular muscle during systolic contraction. During diastole, the cardiac muscle relaxes and no longer obstructs blood flow through the left ventricular muscle capillaries, so blood flows rapidly during all of diastole. Blood flow through the coronary capillaries of the right ventricle also undergoes phasic changes during the cardiac cycle, but because the force of contraction of the right ventricular muscle is far less than that of the left ventricular muscle, the inverse phasic changes are only partial in contrast to those in the left ventricular muscle. Coming to epicardial versus subendocardial coronary blood flow and the effect of intramyocardial pressure. See, there is a special arrangement of the coronary vessels at different depths in the cardiac muscle, as you can see in this figure. Okay. Showing on the outer surface, epicardial coronary arteries that supply most of the muscle. Smaller intramuscular arteries derived from the epicardial arteries penetrate the muscle, supplying the needed nutrients. Lying immediately beneath the endocardium is a plexus of subendocardial arteries. During systole, blood flow through the subendocardial plexus of the left ventricle, where the intramuscular coronary vessels are compressed greatly by the ventricular muscle contraction, tends to be reduced. However, the extra vessels of the subendocardial plexus normally compensate for this reduction. Later in the chapter, we'll explain how all these peculiarities occur. Okay, now coming to the control of coronary blood flow. See, let us just understand the salient features of the coronary circulation. It is 4 to 5% of the cardiac output, that is 225 ml per minute. Distribution of blood flow in right and left coronary arteries varies. Some individuals are left coronary artery dominant, others are right coronary artery dominant. So extraction of oxygen from coronary arteries at rest is high because the heart needs oxygen. Coronary blood flow is closely coupled to cardiac metabolism, and coronary circulation shows auto-regulation of blood flow. Coronary blood flow is phasic. It is more during diastole and minimal during systole. This is more pronounced in the left ventricle, and coronary blood vessels have collaterals. Okay, so these are the salient features of the coronary circulation. So you need to write about the percentage of cardiac output, you need to talk about the phasic nature, you need to talk about the predominance, you need to talk about extraction of oxygen, the auto-regulation property, and also the coupling of coronary blood flow to metabolism and the collateral circulation. Okay, local muscle metabolism is the primary controller of coronary blood flow. Blood flow through the coronary system is regulated mostly by local arteriolar vasodilation in response to the nutritional needs of the cardiac muscle. That is, whenever the vigor of cardiac contraction is increased, the rate of coronary blood flow also increases. Okay. So coming to oxygen demand as a major factor in local coronary blood flow circulation, normally about 70% of the oxygen in the coronary arterial blood is removed as the blood flows through the heart muscle. Because not much oxygen is left, little additional oxygen can be supplied to the heart musculature unless the coronary blood flow increases. Fortunately, coronary blood flow increases almost in direct proportion to any extra metabolic consumption of oxygen by the heart. A substance with great vasodilator property is adenosine. In the presence of very low concentrations of oxygen in the muscle cells, a large proportion of the cells ATP degrades to adenosine monophosphate or AMP. Small portions of the substance are then further degraded and release adenosine into the tissue fluids of the heart muscle, with a resultant increase in local coronary blood flow. After the adenosine causes vasodilation, most of it is reabsorbed into the cardiac cells to be reused for the production of ATP. Other vasodilators include adenosine phosphate compounds, potassium ions, H+ ions, carbon dioxide, prostaglandins, and nitric oxide. Okay, pharmacological agents that block or partially block the vasodilator effect of adenosine do not prevent coronary vasodilation caused by increased heart muscle activity. Coming to the nervous control of coronary blood flow, stimulation of the autonomic nerves to the heart can affect coronary blood flow both directly and indirectly. The direct effects result from action of the nervous transmitter substances acetylcholine from the vagus nerves and norepinephrine from the sympathetic nerves on the coronary vessels. The indirect effects result from secondary changes in coronary blood flow caused by increased or decreased activity of the heart. The indirect effects, which are mostly opposite to the direct effects, play a far more important role in normal control of coronary blood flow. Thus, in sympathetic stimulation, which releases norepinephrine from the sympathetic nerves and norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medullae, it increases both heart rate and heart contractility and increases the rate of metabolism of the heart. In turn, the increased metabolism of the heart sets off local blood flow regulatory mechanisms for dilating the coronary vessels, and the blood flow increases approximately in proportion to the metabolic needs of the heart muscle. In contrast, the vagal stimulation with its release of acetylcholine slows the heart and has a slight depressive effect on heart contractility. These effects decrease our cardiac oxygen consumption and therefore indirectly constrict the coronary arteries. Coming to the direct effects of nervous stimuli on the coronary vasculature, the acetylcholine released by parasympathetic stimulation has a direct effect to dilate the coronary arteries. See, remember two terms: sympathetic bronchodilation, sympathetic vasoconstriction, and the opposite also occurs: parasympathetic bronchoconstriction, parasympathetic vasodilation. So, norepinephrine and epinephrine, they can have either vascular constrictor or dilator effects. Norepinephrine is entirely constrictor. Epinephrine can be constrictive or dilatory, depending on the presence or absence of constrictor or dilator receptors in the blood vessel walls. The constrictor receptors are called alpha receptors and the dilator receptors are called beta receptors. Both alpha and beta receptors exist in the coronary vessels. In general, the epicard, you can remember it like this. See, the constrictor receptors are called alpha receptors. The dilator, okay, dilate, beta, okay, there is like a difference, okay, D-I-B-E, I and E, they sound similar, right? So dilator receptors are beta, constrictors are alpha. Both alpha and beta receptors exist in the coronary vessels. In general, the epicardial coronary vessels have a preponderance of alpha receptors, whereas the intramuscular arteries may have a preponderance of beta receptors. Therefore, sympathetic stimulation can, at least theoretically, cause slight overall coronary constriction or dilation, but usually constriction. In some people, the alpha vasoconstrictor effects seem to be disproportionately severe, and these people can have vasospastic myocardial ischemia during periods of extreme sympathetic drive, usually with resultant anginal pain. Metabolic factors, especially myocardial oxygen consumption, are the major controllers of myocardial blood flow. Whenever the direct effects of nervous stimulation reduce the coronary blood flow, the metabolic control of coronary blood flow usually overrides the direct coronary nervous effects within seconds. So you need to remember that indirect effects are more powerful than the direct effects of nervous stimulation. Coming to special features of cardiac muscle metabolism, under resting conditions, the cardiac muscle normally consumes fatty acids instead of carbohydrates to supply most of its energy. 70% of the energy is derived from fatty acids. However, as is also true of other tissues, under anaerobic or ischemic conditions, cardiac metabolism must call on anaerobic glycolysis mechanisms for energy. However, glycolysis consumes large quantities of the blood glucose and at the same time forms large amounts of lactic acid in the cardiac tissue, which is probably one of the causes of cardiac pain in the cardiac ischemic conditions, as discussed later. As is true in other tissues, more than 95% of the metabolic energy liberated from foods is used to form ATP in the mitochondria. This ATP in turn acts as a conveyor of energy for cardiac muscular contraction and other cellular functions. In severe coronary ischemia, the ATP degrades first to adenosine diphosphate and then to AMP and adenosine. Because the cardiac cell membrane is slightly permeable to adenosine, much of this agent can diffuse from the muscle cells into the circulating blood. The released adenosine is believed to be one of the substances that causes dilation of the coronary arteries during coronary hypoxia. However, the loss of adenosine also has a serious cellular consequence. Within as little as 30 minutes of severe coronary ischemia, as occurs after a myocardial infarct, about one half of the adenine base can be lost from the affected cardiac muscle cells. Furthermore, this loss can be replaced by new synthesis of adenine at a rate of only 2% per hour. Therefore, once a serious bout of coronary ischemia has persisted for 30 or more minutes, the relief of ischemia may be too late to prevent injury and death of the cardiac cells. This occurrence almost certainly is one of the major causes of cardiac cellular death during myocardial ischemia. Okay, now coming to ischemic heart disease, atherosclerosis is a cause of ischemic heart disease. In people who have a genetic predisposition to atherosclerosis, who are overweight or obese and have a sedentary lifestyle, or who have high blood pressure and damage to the endothelial cells of the coronary blood vessels, large quantities of cholesterol gradually become deposited beneath the endothelium at many points in arteries throughout the body. Gradually, these areas of deposit are invaded by fibrous tissue and frequently become calcified. The net result is the development of atherosclerotic plaques that actually protrude into the vessel lumens and either block or partially block the blood flow. A common site for development of atherosclerotic plaques is the first few centimeters of the major coronary arteries. Coming to acute coronary occlusion, acute occlusion of a coronary artery is most frequently occurs in a person who has already underlying atherosclerotic coronary heart disease, but almost never in a person with a normal coronary circulation. And now let's talk about the life-saving value of collateral circulation in the heart. The degree of damage to the heart muscle caused either by slowly developing atherosclerotic constriction of the coronary arteries or by sudden coronary occlusion is determined to a great extent by the degree of collateral circulation that has already developed or that can open within minutes after the occlusion. So in a normal heart, almost no large communications exist among the large coronary arteries. However, many anastomosis do exist among the smaller arteries size 20 to 250 mm in diameter. So when a sudden occlusion occurs in one of the, you can see the anastomosis in the smaller branches but not in the larger branches. Okay, so when a sudden occlusion occurs in one of the larger coronary arteries, the small anastomosis begin to dilate within seconds. However, the blood flow through these minute collaterals is usually less than one half that is needed to keep alive most of the cardiac muscles that they now supply. The diameters of the collateral vessels do not enlarge much more for the next 8 to 24 hours. But then collateral flow begins to increase, doubling by the second or third day and reaching normal or almost normal flow within 1 month. Because these developing collateral channels, many patients recover almost completely from various degrees of coronary occlusion when the area of muscle involved is not too great. Coming to myocardial infarction, immediately after an acute coronary occlusion, blood flow ceases in the coronary vessels beyond the occlusion except for small amounts of collateral flow from the surrounding vessels. The area of muscle that has either zero flow or so little flow that it cannot sustain cardiac muscle function is said to be infarcted. This overall process is called a myocardial infarction. So soon after the onset of the infarction, small amounts of collateral blood begin to seep into the infarcted area, which combined with progressive dilation of local blood vessels causes the area to become overfilled with stagnant blood. Simultaneously, the muscle fibers use the last vestiges of oxygen in the blood, causing the hemoglobin to become totally deoxygenated. Therefore, the infarcted area takes on a bluish brown hue, and the blood vessels of the area appear to be engorged despite lack of the blood flow. Within a few hours of almost no blood supply, the cardiac muscle cells die. Cardiac muscle requires about 1.3 ml of oxygen per 100 grams of muscle tissue per minute just to remain alive. In comparison, about 8 ml of oxygen per 100 grams is delivered to the normal resting left ventricle each minute. Therefore, there is even 15 to 30% of normal resting coronary blood flow. The muscle will not die. In the central portion of a large infarct, however, there is almost no collateral blood flow and the muscle does die. In the center, you can see here. Okay. Coming to subendocardial infarction, the subendocardial muscle frequently becomes infarcted even when there is no evidence of infarction in the outer portions of the heart. The reason for this is that the subendocardial muscle has a higher oxygen consumption and extra difficulty obtaining adequate blood flow because the blood vessels in the subendocardium are intensely compressed by systolic contraction of the heart, as explained earlier. Therefore, any condition that compromises blood flow to any area of the heart usually causes damage first in the subendocardial regions, and the damage then spreads outward through the toward the epicardium. Coming to causes of death after acute coronary occlusion, the most common causes of death after acute MI are decreased cardiac output, damming of blood in the pulmonary blood vessels, and then death resulting from pulmonary edema, in which there is right heart failure, and then fibrillation of the heart, and occasionally rupture of the heart. Okay, because blood is damming up, there is fibrillation, the heart does not beat properly, and then occasionally rupture of the heart because of excessive accumulation of blood. And if there is excessive accumulation of blood in the right heart, it causes pulmonary edema. Okay, so and decreased cardiac output. Coming to stages of recovery from acute myocardial infarction, you can see here in the upper left part of this entire figure, that is in this, you can see the effects of acute coronary occlusion in a patient with a small area of muscle ischemia, and here we can see a large area of ischemia. Okay, when the area of ischemia is small, little or no death of the muscle cells may occur, but part of the muscle often does become temporarily non-functional because of inadequate nutrition to support muscular contraction. When the area of ischemia is large, some of the muscle fibers in the center, they die rapidly within 1 to 3 hours, where there is total cessation of coronary blood supply. Immediately around the area is a non-functional area, with failure of contraction and usually a failure of impulse conduction. Then extending circumferentially around the non-functional area is an area that is still contracting but only weakly because of mild ischemia. Coming to replacement of dead muscle by scar tissue, shortly after the occlusion, the muscle fibers in the center of the ischemic area die. Okay, then what happens is during the ensuing days, the area of dead fibers becomes bigger because many of the marginal fibers finally succumb to the prolonged ischemia. At the same time, because of enlargement of collateral arterial channels supplying the outer rim of the infarcted area, much of the non-functional muscle recovers. After a few days to 3 weeks, most of the non-functional muscle becomes functional again or dies, one or the other. In the meantime, fibrous tissue begins developing among the dead muscle fibers because ischemia can stimulate growth of fibroblasts and promote development of greater than normal quantities of fibrous tissue. And therefore, the dead muscle tissue is gradually being replaced by fibrous tissue. Then, because it is a general property of fibrous tissue to undergo progressive contraction and dissolution, the fibrous scar may grow smaller over a period of several months to a year. Finally, the normal areas of the heart gradually hypertrophy to compensate at least partially for the lost dead cardiac musculature. By this means, the heart recovers either partially or almost completely within a few months. So, coming to the value of rest in treating MI, when the workload is greatly increased, such as during exercise, in severe emotional strain, or as a result of fatigue, the heart needs increased oxygen and other nutrients for sustaining its life. Furthermore, anastomotic blood vessels that supply blood to ischemic areas of the heart must also still supply the areas of the heart that they normally supply. When the heart becomes excessively active, the vessels of the normal musculature become greatly dilated. This dilation allows most of the blood flowing into the coronary vessels to flow through the normal muscle tissue, thus leaving little blood to flow through the small anastomotic channels into the ischemic area. As a result, the ischemic condition worsens. This condition is called the coronary steal syndrome. Consequently, one of the most important factors in the treatment of a patient with MI is observance of absolute body rest during the recovery process. Coming to function of the heart after recovery from MI, occasionally a heart that has recovered from a large MI returns almost to full functional capability, but more frequently its pumping capabilities permanently decrease below that of a healthy heart. This does not mean that the person is necessarily a cardiac invalid or that the resting cardiac output is depressed below normal, because a normal heart has a cardiac reserve. It is capable of pumping 300 to 400% more blood per minute than the body requires during rest, that is, during exercise. A normal person has a cardiac reserve of 300 to 400%. Even when the cardiac reserve is reduced to as little as 100%, the person can still perform most normal daily activities, but not strenuous exercise that would overload the heart. Coming to pain in coronary heart disease, normally a person cannot feel his or her heart, but ischemic cardiac muscle often does cause pain sensation that is sometimes severe. Exactly what causes this pain is not known, but it is believed that ischemia causes the muscle to release acidic substances such as lactic acid or other pain promoting products such as histamine kinins or cellular proteolytic enzymes that are not removed rapidly enough by the slowly moving coronary blood flow. The high concentrations of these abnormal products then stimulate pain nerve endings in the cardiac muscle, sending pain impulses through sensory nerve efferent nerve fibers into the CNS. Coming to angina pectoris, in most people who sustain progressive constriction of their coronary arteries, cardiac pain called angina pectoris begins to appear whenever the load on the heart becomes too great in relation to the available coronary blood flow. This pain is usually felt beneath the upper sternum over the heart, and in addition, it is often referred to distant surface areas of the body, most commonly to the left arm and left shoulder, but also to the neck and even to the side of the face. The reason for this distribution of pain is that during embryonic life, the heart originates in the neck as do the arms. Therefore, both the heart and the surface areas of the body receive pain nerve fibers from the same spinal cord segments. Most people who have chronic angina pectoris feel pain when they exercise or when they experience emotions that increase metabolism of the heart or temporarily constrict the coronary vessels because of sympathetic vasoconstrictor nerve signals. Anginal pain is also exacerbated by cold temperatures or by having a full stomach, both of which increase the workload on the heart. The pain usually lasts only for a few minutes. However, some patients have severe and lasting ischemia and that the pain is present all the time. The pain is frequently described as hot, pressing, and constricting, and is of such quality that it usually makes the patient stop all unnecessary body activity. Coming to treatment with drugs, several vasodilator drugs, when administered during an acute anginal attack, can often provide immediate relief from the pain. Commonly used short-acting vasodilators are nitroglycerin and other nitrate drugs. Other vasodilators such as angiotensin ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, calcium channel blockers, and ranolazine may be beneficial in treating chronic stable angina pectoris. Another class of drugs used for such prolonged treatment of angina pectoris is the beta blockers such as propranolol. These drugs block sympathetic beta adrenergic receptors, which prevents the sympathetic enhancement of heart rate and cardiac metabolism during exercise or emotional episodes. Therefore, therapy with a beta blocker decreases the need of the heart for extra metabolic oxygen during stressful conditions. Okay. We use nitroglycerin and other nitrate drugs because they release nitric oxide or NO, which is a vasodilator. Coming to surgical treatment of coronary artery disease, we have aortic coronary bypass surgery. In many patients with coronary ischemia, the constricted areas of the coronary arteries are located at only a few discrete points blocked by atherosclerotic disease, and the coronary vessels elsewhere are normal or almost normal. In the 1960s, a surgical procedure called aortic coronary bypass was developed, in which a section of a subcutaneous vein from an arm or leg was removed and then grafted from the root of the aorta to the side of a peripheral coronary artery beyond the atherosclerotic blockage point. Okay, so if there is a block here, Okay, a vein is grafted and it is grafted from the root of the aorta to the side of a peripheral coronary artery beyond the atherosclerotic blockage point. Coming to coronary angioplasty, since the 1980s, a procedure has been used to open partially blocked coronary vessels before they become totally occluded. This procedure is called coronary artery angioplasty, and it is as follows. A small balloon-tipped catheter about 1 mm in diameter is passed under radiographic guidance into the coronary system and pushed through the partially occluded artery until the balloon portion straddles the partially occluded point. The balloon is then inflated with high pressure, which markedly stretches the diseased artery. After this procedure is performed, the blood flow through the vessel often increases threefold to fourfold, and more than 75% of the patients who undergo the procedure are relieved of the coronary ischemic symptoms for at least several years, although many of the patients still eventually require coronary bypass surgery. Small stainless steel mesh tubes called stents are sometimes placed inside a coronary artery dilated by angioplasty to hold the artery open, thus preventing its restenosis. Within a few weeks after the stent is placed in the coronary artery, the endothelium usually grows over the metal surface of the stent, allowing blood to flow smoothly through the stent. However, the reclosure or restenosis of the blocked coronary artery occurs in about 25 to 40% of patients treated with angioplasty, often within 6 months of the initial procedure. Restenosis is usually due to excessive formation of scar tissue that develops underneath the healthy new endothelium that has grown over the stent. Stents that slowly release drugs or drug-eluting stents may help prevent the excessive growth of scar tissue. Newer procedures for opening atherosclerotic coronary arteries are constantly in experimental development. One of these procedures employs a laser beam from the tip of a coronary artery catheter aimed at the atherosclerotic lesion. The laser literally dissolves the lesion without substantially damaging the rest of the arterial wall.